Welcome to the deep dive. Step with us for a moment.
Yeah.
Imagine standing with one foot in Nogales, Arizona,
Right.
and the other just across the border in Nogales, Sonora, Mexico.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same desert landscape, same climate, pretty much the same geography, right?
Exactly the same. But worlds apart.
Worlds apart. One side belongs to, one of the wealthiest nations, while the other is significantly poorer. You see huge challenges with poverty, health, public
So that
services.
difference you could practically feel just standing there.
Yeah.
And that contrast, those two Nogaleses sitting side by side, that's really the central puzzle driving this fascinating book we're exploring today.
It really is.
It dives headfirst into maybe the biggest question out there. Why are some nations rich and others poor?
And our mission in this deep dive is basically to guide you through the core argument of this really compelling book. It takes us on this huge historical journey.
Yeah, from ancient times right up to now.
Using all these examples to try and uncover the fundamental forces that really determine wealth or poverty.
And what's kind of eye-opening right from the start is how the book just immediately challenges what a lot of us assume.
Like what?
Well, you might think, oh, it's just geography, where you are in the map, or maybe it's their culture.
Or even, well, their leaders just don't know the right economic policies.
Right. But this deep dive, we're going to show you how the book argues those usual suspects. They just don't really hold up when you look closely.
Okay, so if it's not geography, culture, or just ignorance, what is the fundamental driver according to this book? Let's unpack that central argument.
Their big claim, their powerful claim, is that it all boils down to institutions.
Institutions.
Specifically the political and economic rules. How society works, how power is shared out, how the economy is basically organized.
Okay, that sounds maybe a little abstract compared to geography. Like, how does that replace something so concrete?
Well, they make a really strong case against geography being the main explanation.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the Americas before Columbus.
Okay.
Civilizations like the Maya, the Inca, places we now think of as, well, less developed. They were actually technologically advanced, had higher living standards than the groups in North America.
Right, same geography back then.
Exactly. Same geography. But after European colonization, you get this dramatic reversal of fortune. The places that were rich became poor, and the places that were poor became rich. Geography didn't change.
But the institutions did.
Everything else did. Or look at the Middle East. Cradle of agriculture, center of innovation for millennia, right up through the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
Then decline set in many areas. Again, it wasn't because the desert suddenly shifted or the rivers changed in a way that explains centuries of difference.
Makes sense.
And they use this smaller, but maybe even clearer example from the Congo. Two related groups, the Lele and the Bouchon,
Okay.
living in very similar environments, but vastly different technologies, different levels of prosperity. The difference wasn't the land. It was the way their societies were organized, their institutions.
Okay, so geography gets a serious challenge. What about culture, then? Isn't there something about, values or religion that shapes economic outcomes?
The book pushes back hard on that, too. Think about the Egyptian protests mentioned in the source.
Right.
When people were interviewed, they weren't saying, oh, it's our culture holding us back.
No, they were pointing fingers.
Exactly. At the political elites, the corruption, the lack of opportunity, the state just not working, they blamed the system, not their heritage.
And that lay example comes back here, too, doesn't it?
It does, because when they had the chance, when the incentives were right, they were eager to get new tech, like guns.
So their culture didn't make them inherently resistant?
No, it was their circumstances,
Yeah.
shaped by their institutions, that held them back.
Which leads kind of naturally to the third idea. Maybe leaders in poorer countries just, lack the knowledge. They don't have the right advisors.
That seems intuitive, doesn't it? Just fly in some economists.
Yeah.
But the book argues that's just too simple and often really wrong. Look at the contrast between, say, early U.S. leaders like John Smith or later Roosevelt, and then figures like Cortés or Porfirio Diaz in Mexico.
Okay.
It wasn't that Diaz or Cortés were less intelligent or didn't understand resources. They were operating in completely different institutional setups.
Right. Different constraints, different incentives.
Which led to totally different outcomes than their U.S. counterparts.
Yeah.
Or Ghana after independence under Nkrumah.
Yeah, the book talks about that decline.
It wasn't necessarily that Nkrumah was ignorant of economics. The argument is that his policies, like taking state control of industries, were really designed to cement his political power.
And enrich his allies.
Exactly, even if those policies were terrible for the country's economy overall.
And North Korea is maybe the most extreme example.
Probably the starkest. I mean, do we really think the Kim dynasty doesn't understand that, market incentives or property rights would boost the economy?
Of course they understand.
But they deliberately choose not to do it. Why? Because those very steps would threaten their absolute political control. Their policies make perfect sense. If your goal is regime survival, not national prosperity.
So it's not geography, not culture, not just ignorance. It's the underlying rules of the game. The institutions. Tell us more about the two types they talk about.
Right. They basically categorize institutions into two broad types, extractive and inclusive.
Let's start with extractive. What are they like?
Extractive institutions are essentially designed to extract wealth and resources from the majority of the population to benefit a narrow elite.
Okay.
They concentrate power. They create systems where, for most people, property rights are insecure, law and order doesn't really protect them, and there are huge barriers stopping them from participating in the economy or using their talents.
And the book gives some pretty brutal historical examples, right? Like the Spanish colonial system.
Absolutely. The encomienda, the mita, these weren't accidental. They were explicit systems of forced labor, tribute, basically designed to plunder gold, silver, and exploit the indigenous populations. Total extraction.
And it continues later, just in different forms.
Yeah, you see later, too.
Yeah.
The book points to, say, Mexico under Porfirio Diaz, key industries dominated by monopolies handed out to political allies.
Like the Carlos Slim example with Telmex later on.
Right, often involving violating ordinary people's property rights to benefit the connected few. It's about rigging the system.
Okay, sounds awful. So what's the alternative? Inclusive institutions.
Inclusive institutions are pretty much the opposite. They're structured to allow and actually encourage the vast majority of people to participate fully in economic life.
Ah.
Well, it means secure property rights for everyone, not just the elite. A fair, predictable legal system. Public services that actually support economic activity like education or infrastructure. And open entry into markets.
So anyone with a good idea or talent can start a business and potentially succeed.
That's the idea. And crucially, these inclusive economic institutions, they really need inclusive political institutions to survive and thrive. Meaning systems where political power is spread out more broadly, where there are real checks and balances on rulers, constraints on the executive, where ordinary people have a voice and can actually hold leaders accountable.
Which brings us right back to Nogales.
Exactly. Nogales, Arizona, operates within a system of inclusive political institutions, democracy, accountability, which supports inclusive economic institutions, property rights, markets, education.
While Nogales, Sonora, historically, has dealt with more extractive political systems, which in turn have perpetuated more extractive economic conditions, limiting opportunities for most.
That's the core contrast.
So, okay, institutions are key, but how do different places end up with such completely different sets of rules? This is where the history really comes in, isn't it?
It really does. The book argues history is absolutely critical because it shapes these institutional paths over long periods. Think about the different colonial experiences in the Americas.
Scottish versus English.
Right. The Spanish arrived looking for gold, silver, and large settled populations they could conquer and force to work.
And they found them Aztecs, Incas.
Precisely. So they built their entire colonial system around extracting from those existing structures forced labor, stripping assets. That's why, the book notes, they initially abandoned Buenos Aires.
Why?
Because there wasn't a big population there to easily exploit or force into labor. No quick plunder.
Interesting. And the English in North America? Different story.
Very different. The Jamestown settlers, for example, they tried to replicate the Spanish model at first. Tried to coerce the local populations, the Wahan Sunakak.
But it didn't work.
It failed miserably. They faced starvation, the famous starving time. Ultimately, the settlers had to do the work themselves, clear the land, farm, build things.
Which created totally different incentives.
Totally. Because if you need the settlers themselves to do the work, you have to incentivize them. They started demanding rights, demanding representation. And over time, this led to things like local assemblies, a more pluralistic political system emerging. It was a stark contrast to the highly centralized, top-down extractive systems the Spanish set up.
Even when they tried to impose more top-down systems.
Yeah, like the book mentions the fundamental constitutions of Carolina. These attempts faced resistance and ultimately couldn't establish the same kind of elite control seen in the Spanish colonies. The underlying dynamic was different.
So these initial differences, maybe small at first, could then be blown wide open by big historical events, what the book calls critical junctures.
Exactly. The Black Death in the mid-14th century is a massive example.
Devastating plague.
Huge shock, wiped out maybe a third to a half of Europe's population. But its impact on institutions, radically different in Western versus Eastern Europe.
Because of those pre-existing differences.
Precisely. In Western Europe, feudalism was already weakening a bit. Peasants had some autonomy. When the plague created a massive labor shortage, guess what? Peasants had bargaining power.
They could demand better terms.
Better wages, lower rents, even freedom in some cases. The Black Death actually accelerated the decline of feudalism in the West.
But not in the East.
The complete opposite happened. In Eastern Europe, serfdom was already stronger. The lords were more powerful relative to the peasants.
So when the labor shortage hit,
The lords didn't compete by offering better deals. They used their political muscle to double down on serfdom. They tightened controls, increased forced labor obligations. The book gives chilling details like required work days per week jumping up dramatically in places like Mecklenburg or Hungary.
wow. So one event, two totally different paths?
All because of the different institutional starting points. More freedom in the West, harsher extraction in the East.
Okay, another huge critical juncture mentioned is the expansion of Atlantic trade after 1600. How did that play out differently?
It also interacted with existing institutions. Take England. Parliament already had considerable power compared to the crown, more so than in France or Spain.
Right.
The wealth generated by this new Atlantic trade, think merchants, shipping, new industries, it empowered a whole new class of people who weren't tied to the old landed aristocracy or reliant on the king's favor.
They became an independent force.
A powerful independent force. And they tended to see their interests better protected by Parliament than by an absolute monarch trying to control everything.
So they challenged the crown.
Exactly. This new coalition, merchants, gentry, even some nobles, had the resources and the motivation to push back against royal attempts at absolutism. This led to huge political conflicts, civil war.
Whereas in France and Spain, the monarchs were stronger.
Much stronger, yeah. They were better positioned to control and monopolize the profits from Atlantic trade. So the rise of a truly independent merchant class, one powerful enough to challenge the throne, was limited. The trade actually ended up reinforcing royal absolutism there.
And the impact in Africa, mentioned in the source, was devastatingly different again.
Tragically different. In places like the Kingdom of Congo, the book argues the immense profits from the slave trade either massively strengthened existing absolutist rulers or, worse, fueled constant warfare and state collapse. It created even more extractive systems focused purely on raiding, capturing people, destroying any security or property rights.
This whole historical path in England then leads to what the book identifies as a really pivotal moment, the Glorious Revolution of 1688.
Right. And this wasn't just swapping one king for another. It was a fundamental shift in political power dynamics.
How so?
That broad coalition we mentioned, merchants, gentry, others empowered by the Atlantic trade and the conflicts that came before, they essentially solidified the supremacy of Parliament over the crown.
Creating those inclusive political institutions we talked about, real constraints on the monarch's power.
That's exactly it. And the book draws a really direct line from this political transformation, these more inclusive political institutions, to the economic explosion that followed.
Yeah.
The Industrial Revolution.
Okay, connect those dots. How did political change ignite industrial change?
Because with Parliament more powerful and representing broader interests, property rights became much more secure for a wider range of people. Crucially, the state was now less likely to just arbitrarily seize your assets or block new inventions or businesses just because they threatened some established elite group.
So innovators and entrepreneurs could actually expect to profit from their ideas and efforts.
Yes, secure property rights, plus things like patent laws emerging. The book talks about James Watt and the steam engine meant that people could invest their time, their money, their ingenuity, and have a reasonable expectation of reaping the rewards.
And it wasn't just the elites benefiting.
No, that's key. The book highlights figures like Arkwright, Trevisick, Brunel, the canal, and railway builders like Brindley. Many came from relatively ordinary backgrounds. Inclusive institutions meant talent and entrepreneurship could rise, not just your connections.
And you see the kind of messy reality of this new system in the debates mentioned, like over the Calico Act or Manchester Act.
Exactly. Different economic groups, old wool producers versus new cotton manufacturers battling it out in Parliament. It shows power wasn't totally concentrated, different interests could compete and influence policy.
Which contrasts sharply with countries where elites actively block change.
Absolutely. The book gives examples like Emperor Francis in Austria-Hungary, deliberately hindering factories and railways because he saw them as destabilizing, a threat to the old feudal order and his own power.
Or that Russian minister Kankrin censoring talk about railways.
Right, fearing they'd cause social upheaval. In extractive systems, the priority is often preserving the elite's position, even if it means stagnation for the whole country. Economic progress takes a backseat to political control.
This really brings us to a central puzzle then. If extractive institutions are so bad for overall prosperity, why on earth do they stick around for so long in so many places?
That is the absolute core of the vicious circle. The elites who benefit massively from these extractive systems have incredibly strong incentives to keep things exactly as they are.
Even if it means the country stays poor.
Even if it means the country stays poor. The book uses the unforgettable example of Mobutu in Zaire, now the DRC.
Right.
He became fantastically wealthy, palaces, fleets of Mercedes, his own conquered capable airport, while the national economy completely collapsed around him. The system worked perfectly for him and his cronies.
And the Carlos Slim example in Mexico benefiting from monopolies thanks to political connections.
Another modern example the book points to. It's not about maximizing national wealth. It's about maximizing the elite's share of whatever wealth exists, often by rigging the rules.
And there's this grim pattern the book describes, the iron law of oligarchy. What's that?
It's the depressing tendency where, even if you manage to overthrow an extractive regime, the new group that takes power often just steps into the same shoes. They capture the same extractive institutions and use them for their benefit.
So the system doesn't fundamentally change, just the faces at the top.
Exactly. The underlying logic of extraction persists.
And this seems like a recurring tragedy, particularly in many post-colonial African nations, based on the book's examples.
It really is. The source goes into detail about Sierra Leone after independence. The new leaders didn't dismantle the old colonial extractive structures, they used them.
Like the marketing boards taxing farmers heavily.
Yes, and using the diamond monopoly for personal enrichment, relying on chiefs to maintain control, just like the British did. The book even mentions President Siaka Stevens creating these brutal paramilitary groups. I shoot you, Siaka Stevens's dogs, to crush opposition and maintain his grip, leading to total state decay.
And Ethiopia is another example, Mengistu replacing Haile Selassie.
Same pattern. The Derg's nationalizations and repression often just mirrored or even intensified the extraction under the emperor. Mengistu even started adopting imperial heirs himself.
And the DRC again, after Mobutu, Laurent Kabila taking over.
Led to another corrupt, disastrous extractive regime. The fighting wasn't about building inclusive institutions for everyone. It was purely a fight over who gets to control the existing extractive state and benefit from it.
And this fight for control, because the stakes are so high under extraction, is exactly what fuels conflict, right?
Precisely. The book argues that when holding state power means you can extract vast wealth, different factions are willing to fight brutally to capture that prize, rather than cooperate to create a system with broader benefits.
You see it throughout history.
Yeah, the Maya city-states constantly warring over tribute and captives. The infighting that crippled the later Roman Empire as it became more extractive. And it's a key reason behind so many devastating civil wars in the modern era. The conflict is often about controlling the extractive machinery of the state.
The book also gives that really chilling example of extractive institutions being deliberately created, South Africa.
A stark, undeniable example. The Natives' Land Act of 1913 wasn't some historical accident. It was a conscious, calculated policy by the white minority government.
To dispossess the black majority.
Explicitly, giving them just a tiny fraction of the land, 13% for the vast majority, 87% for the 20% white minority. The goal was clear. Eliminate competition from black farmers and create a huge pool of cheap, dependent labor for white-owned mines and farms.
Creating mass poverty and laying the groundwork for apartheid.
Exactly. It's a textbook case of using political power to engineer economic extraction on a massive scale.
And sometimes this extraction can persist even if the central state is really weak or almost non-existent.
Right. The book touches on examples like Somalia, where the complete lack of a functioning state means endless clan warfare prevents any secure investment or economic life. No reliable property right.
We're parts of Colombia.
Where powerful armed groups, paramilitaries, basically take over territory, rig elections, exploit resources because the central state just isn't present or effective enough to provide basic law and order. Extraction thrives in chaos, too.
Even that example of the Takali kingdom resisting writing.
Yeah, that's fascinating. They resisted it partly out of fear that literacy would allow elites to create a more effective state for taxation and control, essentially fearing the creation of a more efficient extractive system. Shows how deep the fear of extraction can run.
Okay, but hang on. We do see some countries, like the Soviet Union in the past, or maybe China today, that seem to have pretty extractive political systems, but have still managed significant economic growth. How does the book explain that?
That's a really important question, and the book tackles it directly. It acknowledges that, yes, some growth can happen under extractive institutions. Well, for one, even elites need something to extract, right? So they might have an interest in allowing or even promoting some level of economic activity. And a strong, centralized state, even an extractive one, can impose order and forcibly allocate resources to achieve specific goals, like industrialization.
The Soviet Union under Stalin being the classic case?
Exactly. They achieved rapid industrialization, built a huge military. But how? Through brutal state command, forced collectivization of agriculture that caused horrific famines, massive coercion.
Not sustainable.
Fundamentally unsustainable. The book cites staggering numbers, like 36 million people punished for labor infractions between 1940 and 1955. Growth was based on mobilization and force, not innovation or incentives.
And that lack of innovation eventually caught up with them.
Completely. The system actively discouraged it. Bonuses based on meeting current targets meant managers avoided risky new technologies. Coercion just couldn't replicate the dynamic bottom-up innovation needed for modern sustained growth. The system stagnated and eventually collapsed.
Okay, what about modern China then? Its incredible growth.
The book's take on China is that its growth came from a major shift towards more inclusive economic institutions compared to the disastrous Mao era.
Meaning
Meaning they introduced market incentives, first in agriculture, then industry. They allowed private businesses, welcomed foreign investment, opened up to trade. These economic reforms unleashed enormous productive forces.
But crucially, the political system didn't become inclusive alongside the economic changes.
Exactly. That's the core point. The book is very clear. China's political institutions remain fundamentally extractive. The Communist Party maintains absolute, unchallenged control. There's no political freedom, widespread censorship, repression, intense surveillance.
So it's markets, but under tight state control.
It's market mechanisms operating within the framework and under the ultimate control of an extractive political system. It's not the Soviet command model, but it's also definitely not inclusive politics driving inclusive economics.
So the book is really arguing against that old idea, modernization theory, that economic growth automatically leads to democracy.
Yes, it's a direct challenge to that. The China case suggests growth can happen when an extractive elite allows economic liberalization, as long as it doesn't threaten their political grip.
Right.
Or even if it strengthens it, by generating wealth they can control and distribute.
And resource-rich countries, too.
Right. Places like Gabon, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela show that having wealth, especially from natural resources, doesn't automatically translate into inclusive political change. The political institutions themselves have to transform.
Okay, so if extractive institutions are so persistent and so beneficial for the elites running them, how does a country ever break out of this vicious circle? How do you get onto a virtuous circle instead?
That really is the billion-dollar question, isn't it? The virtuous circle is the opposite dynamic. Inclusive political and economic institutions start reinforcing each other.
How does that work?
Well, pluralistic politics, with checks and balances, constrain elites, making it harder for them to rig the economy for themselves. And inclusive economics tends to distribute wealth more broadly, which empowers a larger segment of society, giving them the resources and the incentive to demand and protect inclusive political rules. It's a positive feedback loop.
But getting onto that loop sounds incredibly difficult, escaping the vicious one.
It is. The book really stresses it's not automatic, not guaranteed. It almost always involves intense conflict, struggle, and often hinges on unpredictable historical moments or contingencies. It requires empowering a broad coalition within society to successfully challenge the entrenched extractive elite.
Let's look at some examples where the book argues this did happen. England, again, post-Glorious Revolution.
That was definitely a struggle for power. But the key difference, the book argues, compared to, say, Cromwell's earlier rule or many modern civil wars, was that Parliament was already relatively strong and represented diverse interests, merchants, gentry, some nobles.
So the winners couldn't just set up a new dictatorship easily.
It was much harder. The existing pluralism, however imperfect, made an outcome with greater constraints on executive power, more likely than just swapping one absolutist for another.
And the United States.
Its history is seen as a long process of developing inclusive institutions, but also one of constant struggle. From early colonists fighting the control of the Virginia Company to later movements like the populists and progressives challenging the power of the robber barons.
And the system allowed those challenges.
Relatively speaking, yes. The existence of assemblies, an expanding franchise, though limited for a long time, and crucially, a relatively free press, the muckrakers are mentioned, allowed these challenges to gain traction and eventually force reforms, imposing new constraints on elites.
Even things like Congress pushing back on FDR's court packing plan.
Exactly. That's an example of the virtuous circle's checks and balances working, limiting even a popular leader's attempt to concentrate power, much like Parliament constrained Walpole earlier in Britain.
A particularly powerful example of breaking extraction is the U.S. South, long after the Civil War.
Yes, because after Reconstruction failed, the Southern elite successfully reimposed extractive institutions, disenfranchisement, Jim Crow, to control labor and maintain power. They, as the book puts it, won the peace for a long time.
But that was eventually broken.
It was, but again, through immense struggle. The civil rights movement, led by organized African Americans like Rosa Parks and many others, putting pressure from below, combined with crucial interventions from the federal government, especially the Supreme Court, striking down things like white primaries and discriminatory voting tests. This combination created a critical juncture that finally started dismantling those deliberately built extractive systems.
What about Botswana, often held up as an African success story?
The book suggests Botswana had a somewhat unusual starting point. Before colonialism, the Swan chiefs had institutions that were relatively centralized, but also had elements of accountability and constraint tribal assemblies, known as kangutlas.
So they weren't purely absolutist.
Less so than many other pre-colonial states. This institutional inheritance, when it met the critical juncture of colonialism, allowed them to negotiate a form of indirect rule that was less intensely extractive than in many other places.
Which gave them a better foundation after independence.
Exactly. It created a different path, avoiding the immediate capture of a highly extractive colonial state, unlike the pattern seen in Sierra Leone or the Congo. Again, contingency and initial institutions mattered.
Even China's big economic shift is framed as contingent.
Very much so. The book highlights the power struggle after Mao's death. Deng Xiaoping's reformist faction won out against the more hardline Gang of Four.
And if the Gang of Four had won,
China's path could have been vastly different, maybe continued stagnation under a rigid Maoist model. But the immense suffering caused by the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution created a widespread desire for change, which Deng's faction was able to tap into, allowing them to push through economic reforms, even while maintaining the party's political dominance. It wasn't inevitable.
Okay, one last point the book makes strongly about foreign aid.
Yeah, it expresses significant skepticism. The core argument is that aid often fails because it just flows into the existing extractive institutions.
It gets captured.
It gets captured by the elites, siphoned off. The book mentions estimates, like maybe only 10–20% of aid actually reaching its intended targets in places like Afghanistan. Or worse, aid can actually prop up the very repressive extractive regimes it's supposed to be helping, like Mobutu used aid to strengthen his grip.
So aid isn't a substitute for fixing the institutions.
Not according to this argument. It might even make things worse sometimes. They give examples like a project to incentivize nurses in Udaipur, India, failing because local political dynamics and instruction just derailed it. You have to change the underlying rules of the game.
Wow, this has been, well, a real deep dive into a massive, powerful idea.
It really forces you to rethink how you view the world, doesn't it? Global inequality.
Yeah. So bringing it back to the core message. Prosperity isn't really about your latitude or your culture. It's fundamentally about the rules, the man-made institutions.
Extractive institutions breed poverty and inequality. They concentrate power, they stifle potential. Inclusive institutions, the ones with secure rights, broad participation, checks on power, they create the environment for innovation, investment, and growth that benefits most people.
And history matters hugely because it shapes these institutions, setting countries on these paths vicious or virtuous circles that tend to reinforce themselves over time.
But the really provocative thought, I think, is if these institutions are man-made, if they are constructed, as the book argues,
Then change is possible.
then change is theoretically possible. But it also highlights just how incredibly difficult that intentional change is,
Hmm.
especially breaking out of a long-established extractive system.
And looking around the world today with this framework in mind, where do you, the listener, see these dynamics? The clash between inclusive and extractive forces playing out, it definitely gives you a powerful new lens.
It really does. It changes the whole conversation.
It certainly does. A huge historical sweep with profound implications. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.
Always a fascinating discussion.